The year is 2025, and somewhere above the Persian Gulf, where the desert wind carries the smell of oil and ancient grievance, the machinery of modern warfare has once again begun its slow and terrible rotation. Not with the sudden shock of Pearl Harbor, with a lightning strike of a blitzkrieg dawn, but with the quiet, methodical efficiency of satellite coordinates entered into targeting computers, of munitions loaded onto aircraft that have never needed to announce their intentions to anyone, of a president sitting in the most powerful office in the history of human civilization being handed a folder, and inside that folder, a choice. And the choice was this: strike the power plants of the Islamic Republic of Iran, darken a nation of 90 million souls, stop the centrifuges from spinning, and the nuclear program that American and Israeli intelligence had been warning about for the better part of 2 decades. Or pick up the telephone, speak to intermediaries, and call it, in the language that presidents use when they have stepped back from the edge, good and productive. And what we must understand, before we can understand anything else about this moment, is that this crisis did not begin in 2025. It did not begin with a single provocation or a single miscalculation. It began in 1979, when the Shah fell and the students stormed the embassy, and 52 Americans were held for 444 days, while the world watched, and a superpower discovered for the first time in its modern history that it could be made to feel helpless. And from that wound, which never healed, every subsequent confrontation between Washington and Tehran drew its poison. The Beirut bombings of 1983, the tanker wars of the late 1980s, when American warships escorted Kuwaiti oil through waters mined by Iranian Revolutionary Guards, the proxy conflicts in Iraq, where Iranian-supplied explosively formed penetrators tore through American armored vehicles and killed American soldiers, whose families were told their sons and daughters had died for freedom without ever being told the full story of who built the weapons that killed them. The assassination of Qasem Soleimani in January of 2020, a strike so audacious that the world held its breath for a week, waiting for the retaliation that came in the form of ballistic missiles raining down on Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, while the Pentagon counted traumatic brain injuries and called them headaches. And then the uneasy, unspoken, undeclared truce that settled over the relationship like a ceasefire that neither side had agreed to and neither side trusted. All of this, every layer of it, was the soil from which the crisis of 2025 grew, and to ignore that soil is to misunderstand the crisis entirely. Because wars are not born from single moments. They are born from decades of accumulated anger, accumulated humiliation, accumulated strategic miscalculation. And what the spring of 2025 represented was the moment when all of that accumulation reached a weight that the structures holding it could no longer bear. When Iran's uranium enrichment had advanced, according to briefings given to senior members of Congress, to levels that were described not in percentages, but in weeks, as in, Iran was weeks away from having enough fissile material for a weapon. And the word weeks in that context, in that room, with those stakes, lands differently than any other word in the English language. And the President of the United States, who had come into his second term with a doctrine of maximum pressure and a genuine ideological conviction that the previous administration's attempts at engagement had been not merely naive, but actively dangerous, had authorized his military planners to develop options, real options, operational options, not the kind of options that get developed and shelved and forgotten in the sub-basements of the Pentagon, but the kind that get briefed to the Secretary of Defense, and then to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and then to the President himself in the Situation Room, with maps on the screens, and generals in their ribbons, speaking in the clipped, precise language of men who have spent their careers preparing for exactly this kind of moment. And the targets that emerged from those planning sessions were not, as many observers had assumed, missile batteries or nuclear
enrichment facilities buried under mountains of reinforced concrete. The targets were the power plants, the electrical infrastructure, the veins through which the blood of a modern industrial civilization flows. Because the logic, and it is a logic, however brutal, that has its own internal coherence, was that without electricity, the centrifuges stop. Without centrifuges, the enrichment stops. Without enrichment, the weapon cannot be built. And if the weapon cannot be built, then the threat that has animated 40 years of American foreign policy in the Middle East is neutralized. Not forever, nothing is forever, but for long enough. And in the arithmetic of strategic planning, long enough is often the only answer anyone is actually asking for. But there is another arithmetic, the one that does not appear in targeting packages or strategic assessments. The arithmetic of hospitals that go dark when the power fails, of water treatment plants that cannot function without electricity, of a civilian population that had no voice in its government's nuclear decisions, but would bear the full weight of the consequences. And it was this arithmetic, among others, that made the decision to postpone the strikes not simply a diplomatic maneuver, but a moral reckoning of the first order. Because to understand what was being considered is to understand that the line between a military strike and a humanitarian catastrophe, when the target is civilian infrastructure, is a line that exists on paper far more clearly than it exists in reality. And the men and women in the rooms where these decisions were being made knew this. They knew it the way soldiers know things that they do not say in press conferences, with a kind of bone-deep knowledge that comes not from reading reports, but from having seen what happens when the lights go out in a city that depends on them. And so when the president announced that talks had taken place, that the discussions had been good and productive, that there was a possibility of a deal, the world exhaled, not because the crisis was over. It was not over. It is not over. It will not be over until the conditions that produced it have been addressed in ways that no single conversation between intermediaries can address. But because the immediate moment of maximum danger had passed, because the bombers that were ready to fly had not yet flown. And in the history of near wars, which is a history far more consequential than it is usually given credit for, the moments of restraint are as important as the moments of action, because the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is remembered not for the missiles that were fired, but for the missiles that were not for the bombers that dropped their payloads, but for the bombers that turned around, not for the submarines that launched their torpedoes, but for the submarine commander who, in the darkness of the ocean, surrounded by depth charges, with no communication from Moscow, chose not to authorize a nuclear launch because something in him, some piece of judgment that no training manual had put there, told him that this was not the moment. And that man, Vasily Arkhipov, is perhaps the most important human being of the 20th century and one of the least known, because history does not always celebrate the people who chose not to do something. It tends to celebrate the people who acted, the generals who advanced, the politicians who declared. And yet, the greatest acts of the 20th century may well have been the acts of restraint, the moments when someone with their hand on a trigger chose to put it down. And this is the tradition, if we can call it that, into which the postponement of strikes on Iran must be placed, not as a victory, not as a resolution, not as the end of anything, but as a moment of restraint in a situation where restraint was neither easy nor politically cost-free. Because there were voices, powerful voices, voices with access to the Oval Office and the ear of the Prime Minister of Israel and the intelligence services of half a dozen nations, voices that argued the window was closing, that the time for diplomacy had passed, that the only language Tehran understood was force. And those voices were not stupid voices. They were not the voices of warmongers in the cartoon sense. They were voices shaped by real history, by the memory of what happened when the world waited too long in 1938.
The knowledge that appeasement and accommodation are not the same thing as peace, by a genuine and not entirely unreasonable fear that a nuclear-armed Iran would be a fundamentally different and fundamentally more dangerous Iran than the Iran that existed without that capability. And yet the president chose, in this moment, to listen to other voices as well, to the voices that pointed to the back channel in Muscat, where Omani diplomats had once again taken up the thankless and essential role of messenger between two governments that will not speak directly to each other, to the voices that said there was a deal to be made, that the Iranians wanted relief from sanctions the way a drowning man wants air, that the leverage existed, that the pressure had worked, that the moment to negotiate was precisely when the other side believed you were willing to strike. And whether this calculation is correct, whether the talks that were described as good and productive will produce something durable, something verifiable, something that the intelligence agencies of the United States and Israel will be willing to certify as genuinely constraining rather than merely performative, whether the supreme leader of Iran will authorize concessions that his own hardliners will denounce as surrender, whether the Republican-controlled Senate will ratify an agreement that its most hawkish members will describe as appeasement, whether the entire architecture of a potential deal can survive the domestic politics of both nations simultaneously. All of this remains unknown. All of this is the terrain of the days and months and perhaps years ahead. And history does not tell us how this ends. History only tells us how things like this have ended before, sometimes with a deal, sometimes with a war, sometimes with a long and grinding stalemate that is not quite either. And what we know, what we can say with certainty as we stand in this moment and attempt to look clearly at what has happened and what it means, is that the power plants of Iran are still standing, that the lights in Tehran are still on, that 90 million people went about their lives today without knowing how close the darkness came, and that somewhere in a room whose location will not be disclosed for years, perhaps decades, two sets of representatives sat across from each other and began the extraordinarily difficult work of trying to build, from the rubble of nearly half a century of mutual hostility, something that might, with patience and luck and the kind of political courage that is rarer than any weapon system, eventually come to resemble peace. And whether they succeed, whether this postponement becomes a resolution or merely a pause, whether the war that did not happen in the spring of 2025 happens instead in the autumn or the winter or some future season we cannot yet name, is the question that will define not just the fate of two nations, but the character of an era. And the answer, as it has always been, lies not in the weapons we have built, but in the wisdom we can summon, at the one moment in history we are actually given, which is always, only, now.